Hey guys, tonight we begin with the ancient Roman Insula, the towering, crumbling, frequently on fire apartment block where most of the city of Rome actually lived, and which was about as pleasant as that description makes it sound. Then we move to the story of Juvenal, the poet who spent his career documenting exactly how miserable Roman urban life could be, and who turned his own poverty and rage into some of the most vividly unpleasant writing to survive from the ancient world. After that, we step into the popina, the Roman street food shop that fed the city's poor, and which operated under conditions that would make a modern health inspector sit quietly in a corner for a while. And finally, we look at the vigiles, the men Rome called its fire brigade, whose official image as protectors of the city turns out to be somewhat more complicated than the job title suggests. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You did not choose your apartment so much as accept it. There was no tour, no negotiating, no landlord performing a careful balance between enthusiasm and professionalism. There was a room, it was available, you could afford it, and those three facts together constituted all the decision-making involved. Welcome to the Insula, welcome to Rome, welcome to the place where you will spend the next several years of your life hoping the ceiling holds. You are somewhere on the upper floors. This was not the result of any preference on your part. The upper floors are cheaper, the upper floors are where people like you end up, not because anyone designed the building with a social philosophy in mind, but because stairs are a deterrent, and deterrents, in a city as crowded and economically stratified as Rome, have a way of turning into class structure. The ground floor has a proper shop with a stone counter. The second floor has rooms with slightly higher ceilings and slightly more natural light, and people who have slightly more money and who would like you to be aware of that distinction, without them having to state it directly. The third floor has families, cramped and loud but functional. The fourth floor is where the optimism starts to visibly erode. You're on the fifth floor and the ceiling above you is the roof, which is to say, it is your problem now. Your room is not large. You have probably used the word small to describe rooms before, casually, the way people say small when they mean merely compact or not enormous. That vocabulary does not apply here. This room is the kind of small that makes you aware of the exact dimensions of your own body, not in a philosophical way, but in the immediate practical sense that when you stand in the centre of it, you can touch both walls without fully extending your arms. There is a wooden sleeping frame with a straw mattress that has, at some point in its history, clearly known better days and several worse owners. There is a small chest for your belongings, which contains most of what you own, and which you have arranged to serve also as a seat because there are no chairs. There is a lampstand, there is a hook on the wall where you hang things. That is everything. You have now mentally inventoried your entire home, and the inventory took less time than you would have liked. The building around you is tall, considerably taller than any structure you might have imagined living inside before you arrived in Rome. Roman insulae, the apartment blocks of the urban poor and lower middle classes, reached heights that alarmed even the Romans themselves, which is a category of situation that requires some effort to achieve. Augustus placed a legal limit of 22 metres on residential buildings, after enough of them collapsed to establish a pattern that was beginning to feel less like random misfortune and more like a structural characteristic of the building stock. Nero lowered it further after his fire. Neither limit was consistently respected, because landlords in ancient Rome were operating on the same basic calculation that landlords have operated on in every era since. Height means more rentable floors, and more rentable floors mean more money. The math is straightforward. The consequences for the people living at the top are less straightforward and considerably more dangerous, and the landlord is generally not living at the top, which resolves his personal relationship with the risk quite efficiently. Your walls are brick on the outside and something more optimistic on the inside. The interior partition walls are wood, or a mix of wood and dried mud plaster, which keeps down costs and keeps up the ambient anxiety of everyone sleeping in the building. You have heard stories, and not just stories, but accounts from people whose faces you recognise, about buildings that went in a single night. Fire, collapse, both at once, in the particular sequence where the fire weakens the structure, and the structure then offers no further resistance to gravity. The city of Rome loses insulae regularly not occasionally, not rarely, but with the kind of frequency that has long since normalized the risk in the minds of people who have nowhere else to go. You have nowhere else to go. You have accordingly normalized the risk. This morning, like every morning, begins before you're ready for it. The city wakes with noise, and the noise does not wait for you to be ready for it either. Rome is a city that never truly sleeps, not because it is glamorous and alive at night, but because it is crowded and operational around the clock. The streets outside your window, and you do have a window, a small one, unglazed and covered only by wooden shutters that you close in winter and open in summer with something between gratitude and resignation. Those streets have been active since well before dawn. The delivery carts that are banned from the city's streets during the day come through at night, rattling over the stone with the specific acoustic signature of heavy iron-rimmed wheels on uneven paving, and the drivers of those carts do not adopt a nighttime volume policy. They shout. They argue with each other at junctions. They curse the narrowness of the streets with an inventiveness that, if the city had been different, might have expressed itself as poetry. The problem with the window is that it solves one problem by creating several others. Open, it admits light and air, both of which you genuinely need. It also admits noise, smell, and the constant awareness that the city is directly outside your wall, in a way that leaves very little distance between your inner life and everyone else's outer one. Rome in the morning smells like smoke from the bakeries that have been operating since the middle of the night, and like the animals that move through the streets in the early hours hauling things, and like the accumulated evidence of human life at very close quarters that has built up in the streets and alleys over centuries into something that is less a smell and more a climate. You breathe it in because you cannot breathe anything else. Your body registers it as normal now, which says something about what the body's capable of adjusting to when given no alternative and sufficient time. You lie still for one more moment, which is not quite rest but is at least horizontal, and then you sit up and the straw mattress shifts under you with the sound of something that has been compressed too many times by too many people before you. You're renting the room, not the history of the room, but the history comes free of charge and announces itself in the mattress and in the smell of the walls, and in the particular way the floorboards have been worn smooth in the path between the sleeping frame and the door. You pull on your tunic, which you slept in because the nights are cold enough, and your blanket thin enough that removing it seemed like an act of optimism you could not afford, and which your body would have disputed in the morning anyway. The stairs are the first challenge of every morning. They are steep and they are wooden and they are shared by everyone in the building, which means they are worn smooth in the centre of each step from years of use, and slightly more stable at the edges, and you have learned this the way everyone learns it, which is through a series of early mornings that were educational in ways that left marks. You descend carefully, one hand on the wall because there is no railing on your section, and the wall is a rough plaster that has been repaired badly in several places and not repaired at all in several others, and you can feel every repair and every absence of repair under your palm. The landlord, a man you have met perhaps 3 times, and who communicates primarily through a representative whose job appears to be the collection of rent and the deflection of complaints with equal efficiency, has been informed about the railing situation. He has been informed about it the way that landlords in every era are informed about things that cost money to fix. He has received the information, processed it, and decided that it does not require action within any time frame that could be described as immediate. The building houses, at a conservative estimate, somewhere between 30 and 50 people, depending on how many families have doubled up in rooms on the lower floors and how many single people like you are stacked above them. You know your immediate neighbours by sound rather than by name. The family 2 doors down has a young child who is sick with some frequency and whose crying you have internalised to the point that you sometimes hear it, when it is not there, in the quiet spaces between other sounds, which is the kind of thing that happens to a person's hearing after enough broken nights. The man directly below you is a craftsman of some kind. You have theorised it is leather work from certain smells that come up through the floor in the afternoons, who begins work before first light, and whose labour transmits itself upward through the floor with a rhythmic persistence that functions as an alarm you did not request and cannot cancel. Across the landing is a woman who rarely opens her door and whom you have assessed, without any real information to support the assessment, as someone who is also just trying to get through it without attracting notice, which gives you a sense of fellowship that you have never acted on because acting on it would require knocking on the door and introducing yourself, and you're not certain either of you is ready for that. The Insula as a social world is worth understanding on its own terms, because it is not simply a building in the way that a building is simply a building. It is a community in the minimum sense that word can carry. People who share a structure and a landlord and a staircase, and the common knowledge of each other's basic circumstances, who do not necessarily like each other or choose each other, but who are connected by proximity in ways that accumulate into something over time. You borrow things in a crisis. You share information about the landlord's patterns. You know whose situation has changed because you can hear it through the walls, in the quality of the arguments and the quality of the silences that follow them. This is not intimacy exactly. It is something more pragmatic than intimacy. The mutual awareness of people who understand that in certain situations, the person closest to you geographically is the only resource available. The lower floors have a different social texture from the upper floors, which is another way of saying they have a different relationship to money. On the ground floor and the first floor, the families who occupy the better rooms are not wealthy by any Roman standard that counts, but they are stable in a way that the upper floors are not quite. The man who rents the corner room on the first floor has been there long enough that his name appears on a tablet in the landlord's records, which is a form of institutional acknowledgement that the upper floor residents, who move more frequently and whose tenancy is more provisional, tend not to have. Stability is status in the Insula in the specific way that anything that represents predictability becomes status in an environment where predictability is scarce. The turnover on the upper floors is higher than on the lower floors, which is obvious once you have thought about it. The upper floors are cheaper, and cheaper means it is where people go when money is thin, and when money is thin it is also more likely to run out, and when money runs out people move, not by choice but by necessity, to whatever is next. You have watched this happen from across the landing. You have watched the room opposite go through 3 different occupants in a year, each of them arriving with a bundle of belongings, arranging themselves in the room for some weeks or months, and then departing, either slightly improved in their circumstances and moving to somewhere better, or not improved and moving to somewhere less defined. The room across the landing is occupied again now, by a young man from somewhere in the eastern provinces, whose Latin is accented but functional, and who keeps to himself in the way that people keep to themselves when they are new somewhere and are not certain of the rules. Rome is a city of immigrants in a sense that is not historical metaphor but operational reality. The city's population does not reproduce itself. The urban mortality rates, the disease and the accidents and the consequences of crowded living at insufficient nutrition mean that the city's 1 million people require constant replenishment from outside, from the provinces and from Italy, and from the various populations that the empire's expansion has brought within its administrative reach. The Subura contains people from every part of the Roman world, men and women from Syria and Egypt and North Africa, and Gaul and Britain, from the Greek East and the German border territories, people who arrived as freed slaves or as free migrants or as part of the demographic movement that a large empire generates, all of them making their arrangements in a city that has no particular interest in how they arrived, but a great deal of interest in what they can contribute. This diversity is not celebrated in any formal sense and not always comfortable in practice, because diversity in a crowded and economically stressed neighbourhood produces friction as well as variety. There are tensions along the lines that tensions tend to form between groups with different languages and different customs and different assessments of how things should work, playing out at the level of the staircase argument and the fountain dispute and the complaint to the landlord that is really a complaint about the person in the next room. You have been the subject of some of these complaints and the witness to more of them, and you have developed opinions about their causes that are more sympathetic to all parties involved than the parties themselves tend to be, which is the perspective that comes from having been on several different sides of similar disputes at different times. The ground floor, when you reach it, is a different world from the floors above. Down here, the building connects to the street through a series of open shop fronts, tabernae, small businesses that rent the street-level spaces from the same landlord who rents you your room above. The landlord has, in this arrangement, created a situation in which he is paid by everyone in the building, from top to bottom, which is an elegant piece of commercial geometry that benefits him at every elevation. There is a fuller who processes cloth, treating woolen garments with the combination of clay and other substances that Romans used to clean and thicken fabric, a process that is effective and industrially significant, and produces a smell so particular and so persistent that it has become simply part of the building's identity in the way that some smells become part of a place so thoroughly that they are no longer smells so much as characteristics. There is a man who sells olive oil from large ceramic jars set into a stone counter. There is a wine shop that opens early because its customers require it to, and whose customers in the early morning have the specific quality of people for whom the early morning and the wine shop are solutions to the same problem. You step out onto the street and the city folds around you at once. The streets of the Subura, which is where the densest and most chaotic of Rome's residential neighbourhoods sat, in the valley between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, tucked below the wealthier heights that surround it on three sides, are narrow in a way that is not charming. They are narrow because Rome grew without a plan, or rather it grew with plans that were each locally reasonable and globally incoherent, filling in every available space with buildings that were constructed in conversation with profit margins rather than urban design. The streets curve and compress and occasionally open into small squares that feel extravagantly spacious by comparison, before narrowing again without warning, as if the city briefly lost its nerve and then recovered it. The morning crowd is already in full motion. Delivery carts were banned from the city during daylight hours, which meant they came through at night, and the damage they did to the street surfaces is fresh evidence that last night was productive for the city's supply chain and somewhat less productive for the people trying to sleep above it. The ruts in the stone are deep and well established, worn by decades of iron-rimmed wheels following the same routes, and the street surfaces between them are uneven in ways that keep you paying attention to where your feet land. You step around them without thinking, the way you step around everything in the city, with the automatic spatial awareness of someone who has learned that inattention is expensive. People are everywhere. The city of Rome in the imperial period held perhaps 1 million people within its boundaries, a number that staggers the imagination when you try to picture where they all went. The answer is that they went here, into these streets, into these insulae, into a density of human occupation that had no parallel in the ancient world and would not be matched again in Europe for more than 1,000 years. And most of them were not wealthy. Most of them were not senators or equestrians or merchants with comfortable houses and private gardens. Most of them were people like you, working people, freed people, immigrants who had come from every corner of the empire and who in Rome found themselves absorbed into the anonymous mass of the urban poor. Craftsmen, day labourers, people who performed services for whoever needed them, performed that day, and who lived above wine shops and fullers and olive oil sellers on the upper floors of buildings that were periodically on fire. You move through the morning crowd with your elbows close to your body because there is no other option. The street is not wide enough for generosity of personal space. You are jostled, not aggressively, not intentionally, just continuously, because in a crowd this dense collision is not an event, but a baseline condition of movement. Someone is selling bread from a basket balanced on their head, navigating the press with a focus that suggests this is a skill requiring as much practice as any craft. Someone else is arguing with a man who appears to be blocking an entrance, loudly, in the operatic way that Roman street disputes tend to develop, with the rapid escalation of people who have been in enough of these situations to know that the first person to raise their voice has usually determined the trajectory. A dog of uncertain ownership stands near a wall, regarding the entire scene with the dignified indifference of an animal that has been in worse situations and has developed a policy of not being surprised by any of them. The smell of the street shifts as you move through it. Near the fuller's establishment, that particular sharp quality, layered and persistent. Near the bakery at the corner, something warm and briefly wonderful that your body responds to with an urgency that reminds you have not yet eaten. Near the gutter that runs down the centre of the street, carrying whatever needs to be carried away, something that requires no elaboration. Rome has sewers, the Cloaca Maxima, the great drain that runs beneath the city and empties into the Tiber, is an engineering achievement of genuine antiquity and genuine ambition, and the Romans are justifiably proud of it. It is also a system that serves the main drains and the public latrines but does not connect to the upper floors of residential buildings, which means that the question of what happens to human waste in an insula is answered in ways that are technically legal and consistently unpleasant for everyone involved and not involved. You know the answer. You have been the answer every morning with the chamber pot. The chamber pot that sits in the corner of your room and that you carry down 5 flights of stairs to the designated dung heap near the base of the building, because you are a person who does this, who makes the trip, who does not simply open the window and make the calculation that the distance is sufficient. This is a moral position you hold, and you hold it with more conviction on some mornings than others, and the conviction is strongest when you remember the time you were walking below a window and someone made a different calculation, and the conviction requires no further reinforcement beyond that memory. Not everyone is a person who makes the trip. The pots that get emptied from windows into the street below are a known hazard of urban life in Rome, documented enough that there was actually legal recourse for people struck by falling refuse, a fact that tells you both about Roman jurisprudence and about the frequency of the problem that made such law necessary. The public latrines are not far, and they are better than the alternative in most respects. They are social spaces in a way that requires some adjustment if you come from a culture with different assumptions about privacy and bodily function, which you almost certainly do because nearly everyone in Rome comes from somewhere else, drawn by the city's gravity and kept by its momentum. The Romans sit in rows on stone or marble seats, above channels of running water, sometimes in rooms with decorated walls and carefully maintained facilities, and they conduct conversations with the ease of people who have long since resolved the philosophical question of whether this context is appropriate for conversation. The answer in Rome is that almost every context is appropriate for conversation, because Rome is a city that is always talking, and the body's needs are not considered a compelling enough reason to pause the talk. You use the facilities with the matter-of-fact efficiency that the Romans bring to this as to most things. Wash your hands at the fountain on the corner from water that comes through one of the city's aqueducts, cold and clean in a way that briefly feels like a luxury even though it is free. And then you stand in the street for a moment and consider the day. Work. That is the day. What kind of work depends on what you have arranged, what is available, what your skills permit, and what the morning's labour market will absorb. Rome's economy runs on the labour of the vast majority of its population, most of whom are not enslaved but who occupy the various registers of free and freedman status that constitute the working city's enormous and largely invisible workforce. There are craftsmen, carriers, construction workers, porters, assistants of various kinds, people who perform services for whoever needs them performed that day. The economy is immediate and daily, in a way that means yesterday's arrangements do not automatically apply to today, and tomorrow's arrangements cannot be assumed from today's, and the planning horizon for a person in your situation is measured in days rather than years, which is both a form of freedom and a form of precarity that are so thoroughly mixed together that separating them is probably not a useful exercise. The route to wherever you are going takes you through the neighbourhood in its full morning complexity. You pass a man repairing a sandal on the street outside his shop, working with the focused unhurriedness of someone who's been doing this for long enough that the work requires no conscious attention, freeing his mind for the observation of everyone who passes and the formulation of opinions about each of them. You pass two women deep in a conversation that has the specific quality of a conversation that has been going on for some time and that will continue for some time after you have passed, and that concerns something serious enough to occupy both of their faces with an expressive engagement that makes you curious and also makes you walk a little faster, because the particular intensity of that kind of conversation tends to expand to include bystanders if given the opportunity. You pass a section of wall where someone has written something in charcoal that you do not stop to read, but which is almost certainly an expression of an opinion about a person or an establishment, because the walls of the Subura are Rome's most democratically maintained communication network, available to anyone with charcoal and a few seconds of unobserved time. The sun is climbing now, and with it comes the heat, because Rome in summer is serious about heat, in the way that a city built in a river valley in central Italy, surrounded by brick and stone that absorbs and radiates warmth with considerable enthusiasm, tends to be serious about it. The buildings on either side of the street are close enough to provide some shade in the early morning, their upper floors nearly touching in the narrower alleys, but as the sun rises and the angle changes, the shade retreats and the full attention of the Roman summer arrives without apology. Your tunic, which was perfectly comfortable in the pre-dawn cool, is now doing something different. The fabric sticks. The air between it and your skin becomes warm in a way that is not pleasant. You walk faster, hoping that movement will create a breeze, which it does, but only enough to know it is theoretically possible. The baths are one of the genuine gifts that the city provides to the people who live in it, without kitchens or private water connections, and you use them with the regularity that the price and the hours permit. The public baths, the thermae and the smaller balnea scattered through the neighbourhoods, are not the enormous imperial complexes of the Baths of Caracalla or the Baths of Diocletian, which belong to a later period of Roman history and which represent the institution at its most extravagant. The baths you use are the smaller neighbourhood balnea, private establishments that charge a small entry fee, where the rooms are not decorated with the multicoloured marble of the imperial complexes, but which function essentially the same way. The cold room, the warm room, the hot room, the communal basins and pools, the oil and the scrapers, the social life that develops in the space around the bathing itself. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The baths are social infrastructure as much as they are hygienic infrastructure, which is how Rome uses them and how the people who use them understand them. A great deal of the city's business and conversation happens in the baths, not because the baths are a formal meeting place, but because they are a place where large numbers of people are gathered together in conditions that encourage conversation, stripped of most of the markers of social distance, with time to talk and nothing immediately requiring their attention. You learn things in the baths, you hear things in the baths, you occasionally have conversations in the baths that are more substantive than the conversations that happen in more formally constructed social settings, because the informality of the setting removes some of the caution that people bring to conversations where they feel they are being watched and assessed. The bathing routine is one of the rhythms that the city has built into your week. You do not go every day because every day costs money and money has better uses on some days. You go enough to maintain the social function of the institution alongside the practical one, enough to remain recognisable to the people you encounter there, enough to keep yourself clean in the way that being clean in Rome requires, which is not a matter of private hygiene so much as a matter of participation in the city's shared understanding of what a person who is managing their situation looks like. The Subura has its own baths, of course, several of them, because the density of the neighbourhood makes supporting such establishments economically viable. The one you use most often is on a corner 3 streets away, run by a man whose name you know from the sign outside the entrance and who you have never seen because the man who takes the entrance fee is not the owner, and the owner appears to be the kind of person who manages at the level of ownership rather than at the level of operation. You pay the fee, you enter, you bathe, you exit. The transaction is complete and comfortable, and one of the things about the city that you think well of without reservation. Your room on the 5th floor will be genuinely unpleasant by midday. This is why much of Roman life happens outside, in the streets and forums and porticos and public spaces, not because Romans have a particularly idealistic commitment to the civic sphere, but because inside is often worse. The Insula holds the heat of the day and releases it slowly at night, which means that in summer, the upper floors are warm when you want to sleep, and cooler in the middle of the day when you might want to rest, a temporal arrangement that serves no one's actual schedule with any competence. You have adapted. Most things here are adaptations rather than solutions, and after a while the distinction stops mattering. Midday arrives with authority. The heat peaks and the city's pace adjusts, not by stopping. Rome does not stop, but by shifting into a lower register, a midday lull in which the most sensible thing to do is find shade and stay in it, and conduct whatever business can be conducted from shade. The midday meal, for those who can afford a proper one, is taken at home or at the nearest cookshop. For those who cannot, it is whatever can be bought cheaply and eaten standing up, which in Rome means quite a lot, because the city has developed an entire infrastructure of street food and low-cost eating establishments, precisely because most people in Insula do not have kitchens, and most people do not have the income for a sit-down establishment, and most people are, most of the time, eating as efficiently as the circumstances allow. This is the point that requires emphasis, because it's one of the things about Roman life that feels most different from the assumptions people bring to it. You do not have a kitchen. Almost no one on the upper floors of an insula has anything that could reasonably be called a kitchen, because kitchens involve fire, and fire in a building made partly of wood and crammed full of people who have no easy way to exit from the upper floors is not a risk that most landlords are willing to formalise into a permanent installation. There are people who cook on small braziers in their rooms anyway, because necessity is a powerful argument, and cold food, in a cold room in a cold winter, is its own kind of suffering, and there are fires that result from this because wood and dried straw and small children and proximity to an open flame are not a combination that requires a great deal of imagination to see the outcome of. But officially, the upper floors do not cook, Officially, the upper floors eat out. The afternoon stretches with its particular quality of duration. Work, if you found it, occupies the daylight hours in the way that work does when you're being paid by the task or by the day rather than by the year, with a completeness that leaves a little room for anything else while it is happening. The city moves around you as you move through it, each person inside their own version of the same calculation, time and money and energy, and the question of what there is enough of and what there is not enough of. By mid-afternoon, the shadows have begun to shift and lengthen, and the quality of the light has changed from the flat white of midday to something with more colour and more depth, and the city's pace begins to change with it. The Subura in the afternoon has its own particular energy. The men and women who are at work in the morning begin to circulate, not going home exactly, because home is a room on an upper floor that is still warm from the day, but moving toward the spaces that function as common areas, the wine shops, the street corners where people gather to talk, the fountains where the day's events are processed collectively. The city is deeply social in a way that does not require formal occasion. People talk in the street. They stop to exchange information, argument, and the particular kind of humour that emerges when people who are in the same situation together have processed it long enough to find it funny. The Subura's humour is dry and dark and specific, the kind that only makes sense inside the particular circumstances that produced it. You return to the building as the light begins to go golden. The stairs are the same stairs they were this morning, which is to say they are an experience you have not yet found a way to feel neutral about. You climb them with the particular energy of someone who's been on their feet for most of the day and who is very aware of how many steps remain. 5 floors is the work of a few minutes for a person who has not been walking since dawn. For you, at this hour, it is a longer negotiation. Your legs register each step with a specificity that was not present this morning. Your back makes its own quiet comment. You arrive at your door with the feeling of someone who has accomplished something minor but genuine, which is an appropriate feeling for the occasion. Your room in the evening is different from your room in the morning. In the morning it is a place you are leaving. In the evening it is a place you're returning to, which grants it a warmth it does not technically possess. The window, facing west, lets in the last of the light, and for perhaps half an hour the room is genuinely pleasant. The orange light filtering through the shutters and making everything look briefly like something you might have chosen rather than accepted. The straw mattress glows. The chest looks less battered. The hook on the wall holds your things with a solidity that the morning version of the same objects does not quite achieve. You stand in this light for a moment before doing anything else, because half an hour is a specific amount of time and you have learned to use it. Then the light goes and the lamp goes on, and the lamp is olive oil and a wick and the specific quality of light that olive oil produces, which is warm and slightly unsteady, and which fills the room with its own faint smell layered on top of everything else. The circle of light it casts is small enough that the edges of the room recede into shadow, and in the shadow the room is larger than it is in daylight, which is a small mercy that the evening regularly provides. You eat what you have, bread and olives, some dried fish, a small amount of wine mixed with water, because wine unmixed is for people with more to celebrate than you currently have, and because the wine you can afford does not benefit from being tasted too carefully in any case. The meal takes less time than you would like. Satiety is not really the target. The target is continuation, enough to get through the night and into another day, which is also, on reflection, most of what the day was for. The building settles around you as the hour grows late. Not into silence. Nothing in this building is ever silent, but into a different register of noise. The street outside quiets somewhat, though the delivery carts will return before long, and you know exactly what they sound like on the stones because you have had a great deal of time to learn. The man below you stops his work around the 3rd hour of the night, which you register not as a sound but as its absence, a suddenly different quality of quiet below you that your body has learned to interpret as a kind of permission to relax a few degrees. The child along the corridor is quiet tonight, which could mean anything, and which you choose to interpret as good news, because choosing to interpret ambiguous information as good news is one of the small adjustments you have made to your interpretive framework since you arrived in the Subura. You lie back on the straw mattress and the familiar compression begins and the smell of your own room, which you do not notice during the day because familiarity operates as a kind of courtesy to itself, returns to you in the stillness. There is the smoke from the lamp you have just extinguished, hanging in the warm air before the small current from the closed shutter disperses it. There is the dry smell of old straw and old wood. There is the ambient evidence of the building and everyone in it, layered over years into something that simply is, something that belongs to the air of the insula the way the mortar belongs to the bricks, and the way the worn centre of each stair step belongs to the people who wore it down and who are all somewhere else now or nowhere at all. Above you, the roof. Below you, 4 floors of people in their own versions of this moment, lying in their own rooms with their own lamps just extinguished, their own meals settling, their own assessments of the day underway. Through the walls, which are not thick, the sounds of the building's nighttime life, the low conversation of neighbours not yet asleep, the creak of the structure as the temperature drops and the wood contracts, the occasional sound from the street that enters the building through every gap and imperfectly sealed surface and settles into the ambient noise of the night. You make your way toward the area where you might find work, or at least information about work. The city is organised in ways that are not immediately legible to the newcomer, but which reveal themselves over time with the accumulated logic of a place that has been doing this for centuries. Certain streets are associated with certain trades. The street of the sandal makers has the sandal makers. The area near the forums has the scribes and the money changers, and the lawyers whose business depends on the proximity of the institutions that generate legal and financial work. The docks and the warehouses along the Tiber have the porters and the stevedores, and the men who move things. And moving things is one of the city's most consistent forms of employment, because Rome imports everything it needs from everywhere in the empire, and everything that arrives at the docks needs to go somewhere, lifted and carried by human backs. You have done a range of things in your time in the city. You have loaded and unloaded. You have assisted craftsmen who needed an extra pair of hands and who could not afford a full apprentice. You have carried messages and packages across distances that the senders did not want to cover themselves. You have done the work that the city constantly needs done, and that it constantly underpays because the supply of people willing to do it is, in a city of 1 million people, essentially inexhaustible. This is the mathematics of your situation, and it is not a calculation that resolves in your favour, but it is at least a calculation you understand, which is something. The forum areas are the parts of Rome that visitors to the city write about, the parts that the city presents to the world as its own image. The Forum Romanum with its temples and its rostra and its ancient associations. The Forum of Augustus with its exedrae and its statues of the great men of Rome's history arranged to tell a particular story about what Rome is and has been. The Forum of Trajan, newer and larger and more deliberate in its magnificence, with its markets rising in tiers up the slope of the Quirinal Hill. These spaces are genuine marvels, and you have walked through them and you have felt what they are designed to make you feel, which is small in the presence of something large and permanent and sure of itself. This is not an accident. These spaces were designed with that effect in mind, and the effect works on everyone, including you, even when you know it is working. But the Forum is not where you spend your day. The Forum is the city's performance of itself. The Subura is where the city actually lives, and in the Subura the scale is human rather than monumental, the smells are specific rather than ceremonial, and the business being conducted is the immediate business of existence rather than the long-term business of empire. Both are real, both are Rome, but only one of them is where you sleep. The money question sits underneath everything in a way that becomes clearer the longer you are here. Rome's economy is cash-based in a way that is more immediate than you might have expected, and cash moves through the city's lower levels in small denominations with great frequency, and in ways that do not always leave records. You are paid in sestertiae and asses, the small copper and bronze coins that are the currency of daily transactions, and you pay for your room and your bread and your oil, and your occasional wine in the same coins, and the margin between what comes in and what goes out is thin enough that a day without work is not a neutral event. It is a calculation that needs to be corrected before it becomes a deficit, and a deficit in the Subura is not an abstraction. It is the specific experience of being turned away at the bread stall and standing in the street afterward with the exact knowledge of how much money you have and how long it will last. You have not been turned away. You're not at that point. But you know people who are, and you know how quickly the situation changes from manageable to not manageable. Because in the Subura, the transition is not a gradual decline so much as a series of thresholds, each one visible only when you are crossing it. The people in the worst situations are not, for the most part, people who made catastrophic decisions. They are people who had a run of bad luck, or an illness, or a missed opportunity, or a landlord who raised the rent because the demand for rooms in the Subura is never less than the supply, and this gives landlords options that tenants do not have. The grain dole is part of the picture, though not every part of it. Rome distributes free grain to a registered list of adult male citizens. The plebs frumentaria, roughly 200,000 people at various points in the imperial period, and this provision is not charity in any modern sense, but a political institution that goes back to the late Republic and that has become so embedded in the city's social contract that withdrawing it would be considered an act of war against the population. If you are on the list, you receive your monthly allotment of grain, enough to make bread for yourself and perhaps partially for a small household, which does not solve the question of olive oil and salt and wine and everything else that requires money, but which does mean that the floor of your situation is higher than it would be without it. Whether you're on the list depends on your citizenship status and your registration, which is a bureaucratic reality that the city manages with the particular combination of formal precision and practical arbitrariness that characterizes Roman administration at its most granular. The Insula's water situation is worth understanding clearly because water in Rome is, in principle, one of the most remarkable features of the city, and in the Insula it is one of the most practical irritations. The aqueducts, 11 of them by the 2nd century, bring water into the city from sources in the surrounding hills, a volume of water that is extraordinary by ancient standards, and that supplies the baths and the fountains and the private connections of the wealthy and the public fountains of the poor. The fountains are everywhere. You're never far from a fountain, which is where you get your water, because the connection of water into upper floor apartments of Insula is not the norm. The norm is the fountain. The norm is carrying water upstairs in a vessel, one trip or several, depending on how much you need and how many stairs you have to climb, and then using it carefully because it cost you the labour of carrying it and will cost you the labour of carrying more. This is the texture of daily life in the Insula, not dramatic suffering but constant low-level negotiation with the basic requirements of existence. Water that requires carrying, food that requires money that requires work, sleep that requires darkness that is interrupted by noise, warmth in winter that requires fire that is not allowed. The sum of these negotiations is not misery exactly, because misery requires a comparison point that has ceased to feel available, and for most people in the Subura the life they have is simply the life they have, not a worse version of some alternative life they can clearly imagine. It is in this sense a life, as complete as any other, as full of its own specific texture and its own particular satisfactions, as capable of producing the moments of pleasure and connection and humour that human beings find ways to produce regardless of the external conditions they are operating within. The humour of the Subura is one of its most consistent features, the dry, dark, specific humour of people who know their situation well enough to find it absurd. You hear it at the fountain and at the wine shops and in the brief exchanges that happen in the stairwells of the Insula, the particular form of wit that emerges when people who cannot change their circumstances have spent long enough with those circumstances to find them funny. It is not the humour of contentment. It is not the humour of people who have decided that everything is fine. It is the humour of people who have accurately assessed that everything is not fine, and who have found in the accuracy of that assessment something to laugh at. This kind of humour travels across centuries with unusual ease, because the situations it addresses, being small in a large system, being subject to conditions you did not choose and cannot change, being required to maintain dignity in circumstances that do not make dignity easy, are not situations that history has made obsolete. You think about the city. Rome is enormous in a way that is not abstract when you are living inside it. You have walked its streets, you know the specific smell of specific corners, you know where the good bread is and where the wine is honest and where to avoid in the early afternoon when certain groups have had enough time to develop group opinions. But the city is also larger than your knowledge of it, in ways that become apparent periodically. When you turn a corner, you have turned 100 times and find something different there. Or when you hear about something happening in a neighbourhood you have never visited, and realise that Rome contains entire worlds that are not yours and that you will never see. 1 million people, all of them in their rooms tonight, all of them somewhere in their own accounting of the day. This is not a comforting thought exactly, but it is not uncomfortable either. You are one person among an enormous number of people, all of whom are in more or less the same situation, all of whom are making the same calculations about water and food and rent and work and tomorrow. The scale of it is, on certain evenings, almost relieving. You are not uniquely struggling. You're participating in something collective and very old, the particular human activity of living in a place that was not designed for your comfort, and finding ways to continue anyway. Rome designed itself for empire. You're living in the margins of that design, in the space between the monument and the drain, and you are making it work, or you're making it close enough to working that the distinction is not one you need to examine tonight. The nights in the Insula have a particular quality that the days do not. During the day, the noise and the movement and the constant demands of being a functional person in a functional city fill the available space of your attention and leave very little room for the kind of thinking that requires quiet. At night, in the dark with the lamp out, the city's sounds are still there, but they are different sounds, the nighttime sounds, and they create a different relationship with your own thoughts. The delivery carts that are not yet loud enough to be annoying are just a sound in the distance, like a river heard from far enough away. The occasional shout from the street below is just a human voice doing what human voices do when they think no one is listening. The building makes its sounds, the wood contracting in the cooling air, the floor of the room above you creaking as someone turns over, the sound of the city settling into its nighttime version of itself. You have learned the city's nighttime sounds in the way that you learn anything you are exposed to repeatedly and helplessly, thoroughly without trying to, and in a way that makes the absence of any one of them as noticeable as its presence. On the nights when the street below is unusually quiet, you notice the quiet. On the nights when someone in the building is sick and the sick sounds carry through the walls and the floors, you notice those sounds in the specific way that sounds you have heard before in similar contexts carry their own associations and make you think thoughts you would not choose to think. This is what it means to live in close proximity to other people over a long period. Their lives become part of the texture of yours, not in the warm sense of intimacy, but in the ambient sense of shared space, and you carry parts of their lives with you in the specific ways that unavoidable knowledge gets carried. The city at night is also the city's other version of danger. The fires that happen more often at night, when the oil lamps that should be watched are not watched, and the braziers that should be properly secured are not properly secured, and the human tendency to lose consciousness in a warm room that is also a room with an open flame meets the architecture of the insula. You know this risk, and you manage it with the same quiet resignation with which you manage all the risks of this life, by being careful where careful is possible, by not using the lamp longer than necessary, by keeping the brazier, when you use it at all, away from the walls and the mattress and the chest. You cannot eliminate the risk. You can reduce your contribution to it, which is the version of safety that is available to you and which you practice as a matter of course without spending much time thinking about it, because thinking about it is not productive and produces only anxiety that you do not have the resources to address. The noise of the street is changing now to its nighttime version. Someone's argument has moved outside. A dog or several dogs are conducting their own separate debate somewhere below. The delivery carts are beginning. Somewhere in the middle distance, their approach audible first as a vibration through the stone of the building, before it resolves into the distinct sound of wheels and hooves. Soon they will be loud. Soon the night will have its own version of the day's chaos, and you will lie here in the middle of it and do your best impression of sleep. You breathe in, you breathe out, the lamp is out, the mattress is what it is, the room is your room and the city is your city, and tomorrow the stairs will be steep, and the bread will be dense, and the summer heat will resume its work on you from above and below simultaneously. Tonight you're just a person in a room on the 5th floor of a building that is, statistically speaking, probably fine, and for now, tonight, that is a complete enough thought to rest a life on. Rome produced, across its long history, a considerable number of writers who found the city either inspiring or appalling, or both simultaneously, and Juvenal belongs firmly to the third category, the both simultaneously group, except that in his particular case the appalling portion considerably outweighed the inspiring one, and he was not shy about letting you know. He was a poet of grievances, which might sound like a limited genre until you read what he did with it, and realise that grievances, when pursued with enough intelligence and enough genuine rage and enough literary precision, turn out to be essentially limitless as a subject. Decimus Junius Juvenalis wrote his 16 satires across the late 1st and early 2nd centuries of the Common Era, during the reigns of emperors he mostly despised, and at a time when Rome was simultaneously at the height of its power and exhibiting, in his view, every possible symptom of moral and civic decay. His exact dates of birth and death remain uncertain, which is somewhat appropriate for a man who spent his career on the margins of the system he was observing. He was probably born sometime around the 60th year of the Common Era, possibly in Aquinum, a small town in the hills south of Rome on the Via Latina, the kind of provincial town that produced men who went to the capital with ambitions and found the capital somewhat less welcoming than advertised. He may have served in the military, which would have given him the early experience of institutional hierarchy and official incompetence that his later writing suggests he had thought about. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. He was probably, for most of his adult life, a man of modest means attempting to navigate the patron-client system that structured Roman social and economic life, and he found it humiliating, and he found, sometime in his middle years, that the humiliation was actually material. The patron-client system in Rome was the mechanism by which people without independent wealth managed their existence, their social position, and their access to the things that required access to power. You attached yourself to a more powerful man, a patron, and you attended his morning salutation ceremony. The salutatio, which began at dawn, and which required you to be present in his atrium, waiting, along with other clients whose situations range from the modestly uncomfortable to the genuinely desperate. You waited while the patron finished his breakfast, which he ate in an interior room, while you stood in the atrium in whatever the weather was doing that morning, because the atrium is the waiting room and the breakfast room is the part of the house that clients do not see. Then you were received briefly in an exchange that lasted perhaps a few minutes, and you received in return perhaps a small basket of food, the sportula, perhaps an invitation to dinner on some future occasion that might or might not materialize, perhaps an introduction to someone else who might be useful, perhaps a gesture of vague goodwill that both of you understood to have no concrete content, but which was nonetheless performed with the language of friendship and mutual esteem. Juvenal understood this exchange with a clarity so precise it became its own form of violence. He wrote about it repeatedly, from multiple angles, returning to it the way you return to something that has marked you, not to resolve it, but to map it more fully each time. He wrote about the client standing in the cold atrium, listening to the patron's household going about its business in the warm interior, smelling the food being prepared for someone else's table. He wrote about the sportula, the daily basket of food that was technically a gift and practically a wage for the performance of attendance, and he wrote about it with the particular contempt of a man who has accepted such gifts and who has found that the accepting is its own kind of loss. He understood that the system was built on fictions, on the shared pretense that the patron was generous and the client was grateful, and he found the pretense insulting in proportion to how completely he had been required to maintain it. The first satire opens with a question that is both rhetorical and entirely sincere. Given what Rome is, given what Rome does, given the daily spectacle of corruption and pretension and hypocrisy and inverted merit that the city presents to anyone paying attention, why would anyone write anything other than satire? The question does not require an answer. It is its own answer. Juvenal positions himself as a man who cannot look away, who has been made incapable of the polite inattention that the comfortable exercise as a daily practice. He has seen the inheritance hunter at the deathbed, performing affection for a childless wealthy man whose estate he expects to receive. He has seen the man of low birth who has made money through means that Juvenal finds distasteful arrive at social positions that should belong to men of genuine virtue and ancestry. He has seen the emperor's favourites, the dancers and the freed slaves who have the ruler's ear and who translate that access into power that has nothing to do with merit. He is, in other words, a man who finds his society's failure to match its own values intolerable, which is a position that requires deciding that the values themselves were genuine and that the gap between the values and the behaviour is a failure rather than an exposure. Whether Roman society ever genuinely held the values that Juvenal deploys against it is a question that historians argue about, and that does not, for the purposes of his poetry, need to be resolved. He needs the values to be real in order to use them as a standard, and he uses them as a standard with the conviction of someone who believes in them, which is enough for the poetry to work and which may or may not reflect his actual philosophical position. The fifth satire is the one about dinner parties, and it is probably the one that most directly captures the specific texture of humiliation that the patron-client system produced at its worst. He describes a dinner at which the host serves different food and different wine to different guests based on their social status, a practice that was apparently common enough to be recognisable, but that Juvenal treats as a concentrated example of everything wrong with how power works in Rome. The host drinks wine of excellent quality from a fine vessel. The client of lower status receives inferior wine from a cup of rough ceramic. The host receives a delicacy. The client receives a piece of something that technically belongs to the same category of food, but which is its poor relation in every dimension of quality. The dinner table is made into a map of social hierarchy so precise that there is no ambiguity about where anyone stands, no pretense that the occasion is about equality or shared enjoyment. It is about the host demonstrating to himself and to his guests exactly who has power and who does not. Juvenal's response to this is not to describe the situation neutrally. He describes it with the full force of his contempt, but the contempt is aimed, interestingly, partly at the host and partly at the clients who keep coming back. He asks why you would accept this. He asks what it says about you that you sit at this table, eat this food, receive this wine, and return the next time you're invited, and the time after that. He is implicating himself in the critique because he has sat at these tables, or tables like them, and he has come back, and the anger he directs outward is partly the anger of someone who has not fully escaped the system he is criticising. This is what makes Juvenal's satire something more than complaint. The complaint is real and the targets are real, but beneath the complaint is a portrait of someone trapped in the gap between what he values and what he can actually afford to do about those values, and that portrait is more honest and more interesting than pure moral condemnation would be. His career began quietly, as careers in this period usually did. He was not the kind of writer who burst onto the scene with the full force of his later style fully formed. He appears to have written and circulated pieces for some time before his first book of satires was published, sometime around the year 100 of the Common Era. By this point, Domitian was dead, having been assassinated in 96 in a palace conspiracy that involved members of his own household, and the brief period of relative political openness that followed had given writers some latitude that had not previously existed. Domitian's reign had been paranoid and increasingly dangerous for anyone who attracted attention of the wrong kind, and the definition of the wrong kind had expanded considerably as the reign progressed. Writers were cautious. Juvenal, in his later poems, refers to the dangers of writing about the living and suggests that it is safer to write about the dead, and this is not simply a stylistic choice, but a survival strategy that he had presumably worked out from observation. What he produced when the space opened up was not political satire in any cautious or disguised sense. It was a full-throated denunciation of what Roman urban life had become, delivered in a verse form, the hexameter of the classical Latin satirical tradition descended from Lucilius and refined by Horace, that he handled with the fluency of someone who had been constructing arguments in this meter his entire intellectual life. The first satire, which opens the collection, is effectively a manifesto. He asks why he should write anything other than satire when Rome is full of material. When men of birth are ruined by their passivity, and the city is full of people whose success has nothing to do with virtue, and everything to do with the willingness to perform services that Juvenal declines to name directly, but names with enough precision that no reader is confused. When the client must sit at a table where the host drinks wine from cups of fine workmanship, and the guest receives a cup that is not fine, and wine that is not what the host is drinking, because the Roman dinner table is also a hierarchy expressed in ceramic and glass. The third satire is the one that concerns us most directly, because it is where Juvenal looks most unflinchingly at the Roman city as it was actually experienced by the majority of its inhabitants. He frames it as a speech given by his friend Umbricius, a man who is leaving Rome, packing up his entire life, done with the city, heading for Cumae on the coast of Campania, and explaining to Juvenal in some detail exactly why. And what Umbricius describes, in Juvenal's hexameters, is life in the Insulae and the streets of the Subura, with a specificity and a vividness that no other source from the ancient world quite matches. This is not a philosophical meditation on urban life. This is a man describing the weight of a pot of slops thrown from a window above him, and the calculation he has made about the acceptable risk level for continuing to walk those streets. Before examining what Umbricius says, It is worth pausing on what Juvenal is doing with the conceit of this particular poem, because it is more sophisticated than it first appears. He does not speak in his own voice. He gives the speech to Augustus, who is a real person, or who was invented to seem like one. And this creates a useful distance, because Augustus can say things that Juvenal cannot quite say without the distance. Augustus is leaving. He has made his decision, packed his things, is on his way to the gate. He has nothing left to lose by honesty, and so he is honest, comprehensively and at some length, and Juvenal records the honesty as if he were merely a witness rather than its author. The literary device is as old as the satirical tradition Juvenal inherited. It is also, in the specific political conditions of Rome in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, genuinely useful. A man reporting another man's opinions is harder to prosecute than a man stating his own. But the content of those opinions is Juvenal's, and the specificity of them is the mark of a man who has lived the things he is describing. He is not a wealthy man writing imaginatively about the experience of being poor. He is, or has been, a man who knows the specific quality of a morning in a patron's atrium from the inside, not from the perspective of the patron. He has eaten the sportula, the small basket of food that substitutes for real generosity. He has drunk the wine that is not the wine the host is drinking. These are not hypothetical grievances. They are documented experiences delivered through the vehicle of hexameter, because hexameter was the form available to him, and because the form, when handled well, makes the specific feel inevitable. The noise, Augustus says, will kill you before anything else does. The city never sleeps, and the city that does not sleep is noisy in ways that do not diminish with the hour. The carts that are banned from the streets during the day thunder through them all night, and the drovers and muleteers shout and curse with the enthusiasm of men who know that the city belongs to them between sunset and sunrise, and who have no institutional reason to moderate the evidence of their occupation. A man who lives above a street through which supply carts run at night does not get the rest that a man who lives in a house with a garden gets. He gets something else, a nightly education in the specific sounds that iron wheels make on stone at various speeds, and the ongoing consequence of that education in the condition of his health. Juvenal makes this point not in the language of complaint but in the language of consequence, of a man calculating what the city is costing him and finding that the invoice exceeds his willingness to continue paying. The second satire goes after hypocrisy with the focused intensity of someone who has observed it closely and found it insulting, in proportion to how widely it's practiced. The sixth satire is the famous one about women, which is long and comprehensive and which has the quality, reading it in the full light of historical context, of a man who has been rejected or humiliated by women of higher social status, and who has decided to make this into a general argument rather than a personal grievance, with mixed success by modern standards. It is the document of a mind that is brilliant and genuinely limited in certain directions simultaneously, which is a description that fits a surprising number of the great classical writers if you look at them honestly, and which should not prevent you from seeing what is genuinely remarkable in the work, alongside what is genuinely unpleasant. The first and third satires are where Juvenal is most fully himself, where the anger is cleanest because it is directed at things that were genuinely wrong, and that required a particular combination of intelligence and access to document as precisely as he documents them. The client system, the fire risk, the noise, the crowds, the falling objects, the contempt of the wealthy for the poor, who are nonetheless necessary to the city's functioning. These are not inventions. The archaeological record, the legal codes, the graffiti on the walls of Pompeii and Herculaneum, the physical evidence of the city itself, all confirm the texture of life that Juvenal was describing. He was not exaggerating for effect, or not only exaggerating for effect, he was reporting. Then there is the fire. Augustus describes waking in the night to the smell of smoke, to the shouts from below, to the realization that somewhere in the building or in the building next door, which is close enough to touch your wall on one side, something is burning. He describes the peculiar calculus of the Insula resident who lives on an upper floor during a fire. The man on the ground floor has a very short distance between himself and the street. The man on the top floor has a different kind of distance, and the question of what to do about it has fewer answers than the distance to the street would suggest. Juvenal, through Augustus, does not pretend that the situation resolves itself well for the person furthest from the exit. He says it more directly than that. He says that in the lower city, where the thin poor live in their upper rooms, you die in a fire if the fire finds you, and then Naris, the water carrier, arrives to save what can be saved, which is less than you owned and more than you might have expected. The falling objects are another category of hazard that Umbricius treats with the dark humour that runs through the entire poem. Walking the streets of Rome at night requires a particular alertness, the kind that involves looking upward as well as forward, because the city's upper stories are in the habit of discarding things into the street below. Some of this is accident, the pot that tips on a windowsill, the object placed too close to the edge. Some of it is the calculation that was mentioned earlier, the decision that the distance from the window to the street constitutes a sufficient barrier. Juvenal suggests that the prudent night walker will make his will before venturing out, and this is funny in the dry flat way that Juvenal is funny, which is to say it is funny because it is not entirely joking. The crowds, the noise, the fire, the falling objects, these are the physical hazards of the city, and Juvenal documents them with precision, and with the underlying argument that these are not random misfortunes, but systemic features of a city that has been organised for the benefit of those who have money, and that treats everyone else as a consequence to be managed rather than a person to be considered. The rich man has his litter, carried by bearers who open a path through the crowd. He travels through Rome without touching the street. The poor man walks, and walking through Rome is what Juvenal has described it as: bruising, dangerous, loud, smelly, and not improving. What makes Juvenal's portrait of urban poverty distinctive is not just its anger, though the anger is considerable and sustained through all 5 books of the satires, but its physical specificity. He does not describe poverty in the abstract. He describes the weight of a pot of slops thrown from above. He describes the exact quality of the wine served to clients at a patron's dinner, thin and sour enough that you know he is working from memory. He describes the smell and the noise and the cold and the heat, and the specific texture of humiliation that comes from a system that requires you to perform gratitude for things that are not gifts. He was a man who wrote with his whole body, with the accumulated physical memory of standing in places he did not want to stand, eating food he did not want to eat, smiling at people he had no interest in smiling at, and then going home to a room that was smaller than the dining room he had just left and lying on a mattress that was not the mattress he would have chosen. The 7th satire is worth more attention than it usually receives, because it is the satire where Juvenal turns his focus specifically to the situation of writers and intellectuals in Rome, which is to say it is the satire where he is most explicitly writing about himself, even though he maintains the third-person detachment of the satirical form throughout. He describes poets who are kept waiting in the antechambers of patrons who have no real interest in literature, but who find it useful to be seen to have an interest in literature, because culture was a marker of status, and having a poet in your orbit was a way of signalling a kind of cultivation that had more to do with display than with actual engagement with the work. He describes rhetoricians who teach grammar and rhetoric to the sons of wealthy families, and who are paid so badly for this work that the payment is itself a kind of comment about how seriously the culture values what they are doing. He describes lawyers who receive expensive gifts from clients they have successfully defended, and who are therefore rich, and artists and actors and musicians who have access to wealthy patrons in ways that writers do not, and the whole portrait is shot through with the specific resentment of someone who has chosen a form of expression, the written word, that his society theoretically values and practically underpays. He writes, in the 10th satire, about the things that people pray for, and this is where his thinking arrives at something more settled and more philosophically interesting than the rage of the early satires. He goes through the list: wealth, which attracts enemies and breeds anxiety; power, which makes you a target; beauty, which brings unwanted attention of the kind that is not welcome; long life, which means watching everyone you love die and outliving your own usefulness. He goes through the famous men who had these things and found that having them was the problem. He arrives eventually at his conclusion that the only worthwhile prayer is for a sound mind in a sound body, for the strength to bear what comes without being destroyed by it, for the equanimity that does not require things to be different from what they are. This is not a revolutionary philosophy. It is in fact a fairly conventional Stoic position. But in Juvenal's voice, in the hexameters that carry the full weight of his biography, it arrives with a different kind of authority than it carries in the hands of someone who has always had enough to eat. His anger is not the anger of someone who has never had anything, It is the anger of someone who has measured the distance between what he was promised and what he received, and who has found the discrepancy meaningful. Rome offered the talented man from a decent provincial background a path, the path of education and rhetoric and patronage, and the gradual accumulation of social position. Juvenal walked that path long enough to understand exactly how it worked, and exactly who it served, and what he found was that it served the people who were already at the top of it, who used it to maintain their position rather than to allow movement within it. The path existed, but the destination was not what it appeared to be from the beginning. There is a biographical mystery at the centre of his life that has occupied scholars for a considerable period. At some point, likely during the reign of Domitian, Juvenal appears to have been exiled. The exact charge, the exact destination, and the exact duration are all uncertain, because the sources that report this are later and not entirely reliable, and do not agree with each other on the details, which is the condition of a surprising amount of ancient biography. Later biographies claim the exile was connected to a satire that offended someone powerful, possibly a comment about a pantomime dancer named Paris who had the emperor's favour. And in Domitian's Rome, having the emperor's favour was a position of real power, and attacking the people who held it was genuinely dangerous. Whether this explanation is true, or embellished, or entirely invented by later biographers who found it a satisfying narrative, is not known. What is known is that Domitian was perfectly capable of exiling people for less, and that Juvenal's later satires contain a particular edge around the subject of powerful men who surround themselves with favourites, and who treat talent and intelligence as threats to be managed rather than assets to be cultivated. If he was exiled, he returned. He outlived Domitian, who was assassinated in 96, and he continued writing through Trajan's reign, and possibly into Hadrian's. His later satires, the ones in books 4 and 5, are somewhat different in tone from the early ones. The rage is still present, but it has settled into something more controlled, more deliberate, as if the earlier work had been produced under pressure, and the later work had the luxury of distance. He writes about old age in the 10th satire, which contains his most famous argument, that what men pray for is almost always the wrong thing, that wealth and fame and long life and beauty are each dangerous in their own way, and that the only prayer worth making is for a sound mind in a sound body, and the strength to bear whatever comes. This is not the sentiment of a young man in the atrium of a patron's house. It is the sentiment of someone who has lived long enough to have opinions about what living requires. He died at some point in the 2nd century, probably in his 60s or 70s. The specific date unknown, as is so much about him. He left behind 16 satires, one of which ends mid-sentence, and was either left incomplete at his death, or was damaged in transmission at some point in the centuries when manuscripts were vulnerable to time and to the varying levels of care given to their preservation. He left behind, more durably, a portrait of Roman urban life so precise and so unsentimental that modern historians of Rome still use his satires as source material, citing him alongside the archaeological record and the legal texts and the inscriptions scratched into walls as evidence of what the city was actually like for the people who could not afford to live in the houses that survive well enough to be excavated. That is the particular irony of his legacy. Juvenal despised the system. He found the city grinding and corrupt and organised for the benefit of people who already had everything, and who had arranged the entire apparatus of civic life, the patronage networks, the dinner table hierarchies, the legal structures, the commercial advantages, to ensure they kept everything they had and acquired more of everything they did not yet have. He spent his career pointing this out in the sharpest language available to him in the Latin hexameter tradition, and what happened was that the sharpness preserved him. The precision lasted. The anger turned out to be a remarkably durable form of archive. The emotion that felt most immediate, most personal, most rooted in his own specific suffering is precisely what survived, because specificity is what survives, and sentiment is what fades, and Juvenal had very little sentiment and a great deal of specificity. History remembered him not despite his fury, but because of it. The poet who could not find comfort in Rome became one of the primary witnesses through which we understand what Rome's discomfort actually felt like. He is still being read, he is still being quoted. The phrase, bread and circuses, the most famous shorthand for Rome's method of keeping its urban poor distracted from the conditions of their existence, comes from Juvenal's 10th satire, and it is used today by people who have never heard of Juvenal and do not know they are borrowing from him, which is a form of cultural survival that he might have found, depending on his mood, either satisfying or simply one more irony to add to the collection. Which is perhaps the appropriate place to leave him. Not triumphant exactly, not vindicated in any tidy sense, but still talking, across 20 centuries, in a voice that has not lost its edge, about the noise and the cold and the wine that was not worth drinking, and the city that was not designed for people like him, and the long, strange, illuminating experience of living inside a world that does not care whether you find it acceptable. That is the kind of voice that tends to last. Not the voice of comfort, not the voice of contentment, but the voice of someone who looked at the thing clearly and said exactly what he saw, and who turned out to be right in the way that people who are paying close attention tend to be right. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Not about everything, not about everyone, but about the particular thing they were watching with the particular fury that made them watch it so closely. The popina where you work is on a side street off one of the main arteries that carries traffic through the neighbourhood, close enough to the flow of people to benefit from it, and far enough to be slightly cheaper than the establishments that face the main road directly. This distinction matters to your proprietor in ways that have been explained to you with some thoroughness. It is not a distinction that matters much to you at this hour, which is before full light, when you are already here and the coals are already being coaxed into something useful, and the day has the quality of a problem that has not yet fully introduced itself but clearly intends to. You start early. This is not a preference or a reflection of your personal relationship with mornings. The city eats from the first hour of daylight, and if the food is not ready when the first customers arrive, the first customers go somewhere else, and in a neighbourhood this dense there is always somewhere else, and the choice between somewhere else's is made quickly and not revisited. Your proprietor, a compact, permanently suspicious man named Sextus, who has the affect of someone who believes the universe is conducting a sustained campaign against his profit margins, has made clear that readiness is not optional, and that lateness is a form of theft from his livelihood, an argument you find somewhat rhetorical, but which carries sufficient weight given the available alternatives that you treat it as if it were reasonable. The popina is a single room that opens entirely at the front, the counter forming the division between the interior and the street, a threshold that is permeable in both directions throughout the day as customers lean in to see what is available, and as the smell of the coals and the cooking reaches out to catch people moving past on the street before they have consciously decided to stop. The counter is stone, faced with marble in the front section where the customers can see it, and set into it are the large ceramic dolia, the deep storage jars that have been built into the counter as permanent fixtures, holding the various components of what you sell. Wine in several grades, which is to say in several levels of what the wine was when it began, before dilution and age and the particular conditions of storage in large communal vessels made it into what it currently is. Stewed chickpeas and lentils, kept hot in a ceramic pot suspended over the coals with a care and attention that the chickpeas probably do not require, but which you give them anyway because it is your job, and because there is something satisfying about a thing being done correctly, even when the thing is chickpeas. Bread purchased each morning from the bakery 2 streets away before you arrived. Dense and fresh enough for this hour, dense and somewhat less fresh as the day advances, and the morning's delivery becomes the afternoon's background option. The kitchen, if the backroom qualifies as a kitchen, which Sextus would prefer you not investigate too philosophically, is where the fire lives, and where the smells are concentrated to a degree that takes some weeks to stop noticing, and some months to stop dreaming about. The smoke from the charcoal goes mostly upward, and partially in every other direction depending on the wind, the season, and the particular mood of the building's ventilation on any given day. By the end of the first hour you smell like the fire. By midday the fire, and you are no longer separate entities in olfactory terms. Your clothes will carry the smell all day. By the end of the week it is not something you wear so much as something you have become, and there is a period of adjustment some weeks in when you stop being bothered by this and realise that you have crossed a threshold that is not entirely reversible. The first customers arrive while the sky is still making its decision about what colour to be. They are workers, men and a few women who have been at their own work since well before sunrise, and who want something hot and fast and cheap enough that they can afford it before they have been paid for the day, which is how the economy of the popina's morning rush operates, on credit of the most informal kind, on the understanding between regular customer and regular establishment that the transaction will balance out by the end of the day, even if it has not quite balanced yet. You serve them efficiently, because efficiency in this context is its own form of courtesy. No one here wants conversation. They want chickpeas and wine, and they want to be on their way, and you provide all three in an exchange that is transactional in the best possible sense. Both parties satisfied, both parties moving on, both parties ready to repeat the transaction tomorrow without any of the friction of a relationship. The popina occupies a specific social position in Rome that is understood by everyone and formally acknowledged by almost no one. It is the eating establishment of people who do not eat at home, which is most of the city, and it is the drinking establishment of people who drink too much or too early or both, which is a significant portion of the city, and it sits in the moral imagination of Rome's upper classes somewhere between slightly regrettable and actively disreputable. A judgment that is expressed primarily in the language of what respectable people do not do, rather than in the language of what is actually wrong with the establishment. The respectable eat at home or at the homes of their social equals, seated at tables with proper service. The respectable do not frequent the popina. The popina is therefore a space that belongs to the part of the city that the respectable prefer to discuss without visiting, which they do with some regularity, because disapproving of something is not the same as not being curious about it. You know this. You have heard the comments, usually from people who nonetheless stop to buy something and manage to combine the purchase, with an air of slight condescension that you have come to find more amusing than insulting, because a man who is condescending about the establishment he is actively patronising is making a particular kind of argument about himself. You take their money, you hand them their bread, you think your thoughts, which are your own business. The morning peak passes into the mid-morning lull, and in this lull you do the work that the customers never see. The dahlia need to be checked, stirred, replenished where necessary. The counter needs to be cleaned in a way that acknowledges both its purpose and its history, because the stone has absorbed over years of service a record of everything that has passed across it, and no amount of cleaning will fully address that record, though you make the attempt anyway, because the attempt is part of what the job is. The wine jars need to be assessed. Which ones are ready to serve? Which ones need another day? Which ones have made their final transition from wine to something that requires a decision about its future? You make these assessments without consulting Sextus, because Sextus is not here in the mid-morning, which is when the assessments need to be made, and because you have been doing this long enough to have opinions about the wine that are your own rather than borrowed. The popina's wine is not remarkable wine. This is not a criticism of Sextus's purchasing choices, or only partially a criticism, because the wine that is affordable for a popina serving the Subura is the wine that is affordable for the Subura, which is not the wine being poured at the tables of the wealthy households on the Palatine and the Calian hills. It is wine that has been made in sufficient quantity to be cheap, stored in conditions that prioritise volume over delicacy, and sold at a price point that makes it accessible to people who need it to be accessible. It does its job, which is to be wine, and to be available, and to cost less than the better wine. These are the things it is supposed to do, and it does them. You've developed a relationship with it that is professional rather than admiring. Sextus appears in the late morning with the expression of a man conducting an audit of his own property, and finding the results suggestive of conclusions he has not yet decided to reach. He does a circuit of the establishment, lifting covers, peering into jars, checking quantities against his internal model of what the quantities should be given the number of customers he estimates have come through since he was last here. He makes several observations about efficiency and waste that are both somewhat accurate and somewhat beside the point, in the way that observations made by people with authority over you tend to be both accurate and incomplete simultaneously. Then he departs, carrying his dissatisfaction with him to wherever he carries it next, and the popina returns to its own pace, which is considerably more workable than the pace Sextus's presence temporarily introduces. The cooking that happens in the back room over the course of the day is basic and intended to be. You are not producing refined food. Rome has establishments for that, the ones that serve the wealthy and that have proper kitchen staff, and access to ingredients that a popina serving the Subura does not work with. What you produce is food that is hot, and filling and available quickly, which is what most people in the city need most of the time. The lentils have been cooking since before the first customers arrived, and the smell they produce, earthy and mild and slowly deepening, is one of the constants of the back room, as much a part of the atmosphere as the coal smoke. The eggs, when there are eggs, which there are not always on every day, come from a supplier whose reliability is variable, but whose prices are not, which is the kind of arrangement that you manage by keeping your expectations calibrated to the supply rather than to your preferences. The bread you do not cook yourself. The bread comes from the bakery and arrives each morning still warm from the ovens, which is the best version of the bread, the version that customers who come early get, and which becomes progressively less warm and less interesting as the morning advances into afternoon. The seasonality of the food supply is something you navigate practically rather than philosophically. In summer there are fresh vegetables from the market gardens outside the walls, brought in daily by the sellers who supply the urban food market, and these go into the pot or onto the counter and the menu shifts slightly, not in any formal sense but in the way that what you have to sell changes when what you can buy changes. In winter, the fresh things disappear and the preserved things dominate, dried legumes, salted fish, olives in brine, the roots and stored vegetables that survive the cold months. This is not deprivation exactly. It is the normal rhythm of eating in a world that has not yet found a way to make strawberries available in January. You work with the season, and the season works with you in its own way, providing what it provides and withholding what it withholds, and the popina adjusts as it adjusts to everything by serving what there is. The midday crowd is different from the morning crowd and different again from the afternoon crowd, and you have, over time, developed a taxonomy of the popina's customers that is not formal, that you have never written down, but which is precise and detailed and which you use constantly in the way that people who deal with the public use the knowledge they accumulate about how the public works. The midday crowd includes the workers returning for their main meal, people who have been on their feet since dawn and who are hungry in the specific way that people are hungry after physical labour, which is different from the ambient hunger of the early morning, and different again from the social hunger of the evening. They eat fast and with purpose. They are the easiest customers in terms of transaction because they know what they want it quickly, and they leave when they have it. There are also the regulars, the people who sit on the bench along the wall with the familiarity of someone who considers the bench partially theirs, which is a fair assessment given how much of their time they spend on it. You know their orders before they give them. You know that Marcus, who does something with metal that requires him to smell of iron constantly, always wants his wine with more water than is standard, a preference he has never explained and which you have never asked about, because some information arranges itself around you as a working condition rather than as a fact requiring explanation. You know that the woman who comes on the days when she sells at the market nearby always asks about the chickpeas before she orders them, not because she's uncertain about them, but because asking is part of her transaction, a ritual she performs, and which you participate in by answering as if the question were new. There is the credit that runs through the establishment's daily operations like a quiet system underneath the louder system of cash. Not all credit is formal. Not all credit is even acknowledged as credit in the moment. There are customers who pay today for yesterday, who will pay tomorrow for today, whose relationship with the popina is based on a running calculation that both parties understand and that works as long as everyone's arithmetic matches. The moment the arithmetic stops matching is a moment that Sextus handles with a particular combination of public reasonableness and private intensity, and you try not to be present for those moments because they require a quality of focused unpleasantness that lingers in the establishment for some time after they occur. The afternoons at the popina shift again into their third mood of the day. The working rush is over. The people who remain are the ones who have nowhere immediately pressing to be, the ones whose day has some slack in it, the ones for whom the popina is less a place to eat than a place to be, which is a different thing. Rome has very few places that are genuinely public in the sense of being open to anyone without cost or expectation. The forums, the baths, the public spaces around the great monuments. The popina is not exactly public in that sense because it requires you to buy something, but the something is cheap enough, and the bench is long enough, and the implicit rule about staying is loose enough that in the afternoons it functions as a kind of social space that is not quite a neighbourhood assembly and not quite a private gathering, and is somewhat importantly both. You learn things at the popina that you would not learn anywhere else, because people talk in the way that people talk when they have had wine, and are sitting somewhere that is not their home and not their workplace, and is therefore a space where the usual monitoring does not fully apply. The popina is in this sense a space that the Romans who are not in it cannot quite see, which means it is a space where the information that usually lives underground comes closer to the surface. You hear about the building on the next street that had a fire last week and where 3 families lost everything and are sleeping in a covered portico because the insula is not habitable, and the landlord is in no hurry to make it habitable, because the landlord's calculation about repair costs and lost rent is not resolving in the family's favour. You hear about the man who owes money to several different people, and who has managed this situation through a combination of charm and careful spatial management of where he is at what times of day. You hear about the price of grain, and whether it is expected to change and what that would mean for the bread, and about the availability of work at the docks for the next several weeks based on what ships are expected and what they are expected to carry. This information, the neighbourhood's continuous self-reporting about its own condition, is one of the things the popina produces that does not appear on any accounting that Sextus keeps. It is a form of social service that the establishment provides simply by being a place where people come, and that costs nothing to produce because it is a byproduct of the other things that are happening there. You participate in it without particularly intending to, and over time you become a resource for people who know you work at the popina, and who therefore assume correctly that you know things. They ask you things, you answer what you can, you keep to yourself what belongs to yourself. This is the economy of information in the Subura. Not formal, not commercial, just the natural consequence of a lot of people in a small space with a lot of interdependent problems and a shared interest in knowing what is going on. The specific quality of the afternoon light in the popina is something that takes time to appreciate. The sun has moved enough by mid-afternoon that it enters the establishment from a different angle than it did in the morning, hitting the back wall of the room and the top of the counter and the wine jars arranged along the side in a way that gives everything a particular warmth that the morning does not produce. The coals are lower at this hour, the fire banks down from the midday cooking, and the heat they give off is gentle rather than intense. It is, in a building and a neighbourhood, and a life that offer very few things that could be called comfortable without any qualification, one of the times of day that is genuinely pleasant in an uncomplicated way. You have noticed this, and you have noticed that you have noticed, and you have decided that noticing is enough, that you do not need to make anything more of it than what it is, a good time of day in an imperfect place. You learn things at the popina that you would not learn anywhere else, because people talk in the way that people talk when they have had wine and are sitting somewhere that is not their home and not their workplace, and is therefore a space where the usual monitoring does not fully apply. The popina is in this sense a space that the Romans who are not in it cannot quite see, which means it is a space where the information that usually lives underground comes closer to the surface. You hear about the building that had a fire and about the families who lost everything, and who are now sleeping in a portico, and who are in negotiations with a landlord about new rooms, and who are finding that negotiating from the position of a family sleeping in a portico does not give you strong leverage. You hear about the man who owes money to several different people, and who has managed this situation through a combination of charm and careful spatial management of where he is at what times of day. You hear about the price of grain, and whether it is expected to change, and what that would mean for the bread that you buy every morning, and what that would mean for Sextus's calculation about what to charge, and what that would eventually mean for the customers at the bench who are already calculating how much money they have. None of this is your business in any formal sense. All of it is your business in the sense that you are here and paying attention, which is what being here requires if you're going to do the job well. A popina worker who does not understand the neighbourhood's current state of collective anxiety is a popina worker who will be surprised by things that were not surprising. And being surprised by things that were not surprising is a form of professional failure. The evening is the popina's most complex moment. The working day is ending and the social day is beginning, and the two overlap in the establishment in ways that require management. The bench fills up. The wine consumption increases in ways that are good for the receipts and complicated for the atmosphere. Conversations that were moderate in the afternoon become more elaborate, and occasionally more heated, and occasionally more interesting in the evening, as the day's events are processed through the medium of company and wine and the particular expansiveness that comes when people are no longer required to be at their best. You have learned to read the room with the specific attention of someone who needs to anticipate rather than react, because reacting is always more expensive than anticipating. The man in the corner who has had enough, and who is beginning to develop opinions about the people around him with a specificity and a volume that are going to become everyone's problem in about a quarter of an hour. You see him before he sees himself. The group who are celebrating something, some small thing, a deal done or a debt paid, or simply the fact that the day has ended and they are here, with the genuine lightness of people whose celebration is real. They need nothing from you except the wine and the acknowledgement that their celebration is witnessed, and you provide both. The solitary drinker who is managing something he has not named and will not name, he needs the bench and the wine and to be allowed to sit there without being required to explain himself. And you provide that too, because providing it is part of what the popina is for. You close when the last reasonable customer has gone, which is a judgment that Sextus has authorized you to make, and which you make with the accumulated experience of someone who knows the difference between the last reasonable customer and the customers who come after, who are a different category of customer, and one that the establishment is not equipped to serve well. You bank the coals, you cover the dahlia with their lids, you wipe the counter, in the way the counter gets wiped at the end of the day, which is more methodically than it gets wiped during the day, with the attention of someone closing up rather than maintaining, putting things in order not for the next customer, but for the next morning, for the version of yourself who will arrive before full light and find everything as it should be and begin again. You sweep the floor. The floor of the popina at the end of the day tells a precise story of the day's business, and sweeping it is a form of reading. Then you step out into the street, which at this hour is quieter but not quiet, and you begin the walk back through the streets of Rome, carrying the smell of the fire and the day's worth of transactions, and the accumulated weight of being present and attentive from before dawn until now. The city is moving around you in its nighttime version, the same city rearranged into different purposes by the change of light and the change of hour. You move through it with the ease of someone who has been doing this for long enough that the city is no longer something you navigate so much as something you inhabit, which is a different relationship and one that has its own comfort. The city is large and it does not care about you in any personal sense, and it will still be here when you are gone. But you are here now. You know its streets. You know the smell of its corners. You know, without consciously deciding to know, which way to go, and so you go there, and the night city closes around you and carries you home. The walk home at this hour has its own particular texture, distinct from the walk to work in the morning, distinct from any errand or trip you have made in the ordinary daylight hours. The streets at this hour are not empty, because the streets of Rome are never truly empty, but the population that occupies them now is a different population than the one that floods through them in the hours after dawn. The carts have been out since dusk. Moving their loads through the streets that day traffic makes impassable, driven by men whose working hours are inverted from those of most of the city, men who know the streets in the way you know the popina, from the inside from repeated immersion. They pass you with the particular indifference of people who are working when everyone else is not, the comfortable self-possession of those who have the night to themselves in a way that the day never quite allows. There are others. The men who come out of the taverns and the thermopolia at the later hours are a visible presence, variable in their condition and their intentions, and you have learned to read them with the same quick assessment that serves you behind the counter, the reading that happens faster than the decision that follows from it, because you have been doing this long enough that the assessment is now mostly automatic. Most of them are fine. Most of them are men who drank too much and who are finding their way home through the familiar streets with the particular careful deliberateness of people who know they are impaired and are compensating accordingly. They are not a problem. They are part of the city at this hour in the way that the carts are part of the city, a regular feature of the landscape that requires acknowledgement and occasionally some minor navigation, but nothing more. Your own fatigue by this point in the evening is not the sharp fatigue of the early exhaustion, but the settled, deep fatigue of a body that has worked hard for a long time, and that is now processing the work the way a fire processes wood, steadily, quietly, and without requiring any additional input from the person it belongs to. Your feet know the way. Your legs carry you without being asked to. Some part of your attention is on the street, on the practical business of not walking into the things that need to be walked around, but the rest of you is already somewhere further along in the evening, already at the room, already horizontal, already in the particular state of not thinking that the body achieves when it has been allowed to stop. The room when you reach it is the room you left before dawn, which is small and which contains what it contains, which is not much, but which is yours in the practical sense that you are the one who sleeps in it, and who keeps your things in it, and who wakes in it in the morning to begin again. You do not light the lamp. There is nothing in the room that requires illumination at this hour. You lie down in the dark, in the particular dark of Rome at night, which is not quite dark because the city never entirely extinguishes itself, because there are always lamps burning somewhere, always the suggestion of orange light under the door or through the gap in the shutter, always the sounds of the city in its nighttime version, the carts, the voices, the dogs, the particular soundtrack of 1 million people arranged in close proximity and going about the parts of their lives that happen in the hours when most of them are supposed to be asleep. The noise is familiar. The noise is, at this point, the texture of sleep itself, the background against which sleep happens, without which the silence might feel stranger than the sound. The Vigils of Rome present one of those cases where the official image and the operational reality diverge so gradually and so completely that by the time you examine them carefully, they have become two entirely different institutions sharing a single name. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The official image is clean and civic-minded and speaks warmly of public service. Trained men organised into professional cohorts, equipped with appropriate technology, stationed at strategic points throughout the city, ready to respond to the fires that were among Rome's most persistent and deadly urban problems. The operational reality is more complicated, more human, and in several respects more interesting, not because it is a story of failure, but because it is a story of what happens when you take an institutional mandate and hand it to actual people operating in actual conditions, with the actual incentives that their situation created. The force was established by Augustus in the year 6 of the Common Era, following a series of catastrophic fires that had demonstrated with some force the inadequacy of the existing arrangements. Before the Vigils, fire response in Rome had been left to a combination of private slave brigades owned by men like Marcus Licinius Crassus, who famously allowed buildings to burn while he negotiated the purchase price with their owners from the street below, and informal neighbourhood efforts that were neither organised nor equipped for anything beyond the smallest fires. The result was predictable. Buildings burned, people died. The city that Augustus was in the process of transforming from brick to marble, as he claimed in his Res Gestae, kept being reduced to ash before the marble could be properly installed. Augustus organised the Vigils as a professional corps, divided across 7 cohorts of approximately 1,000 men each, giving a total strength of around 7,000 men, each cohort responsible for 2 of the city's 14 administrative regions, stationed in barracks called stations and excubatoria at strategic points throughout the urban area. They were equipped with tools, pumps that operated by hand and by lever, the siphons, buckets, hooks for pulling apart burning structures to create fire breaks, axes, ladders, and the siphonarii, the pump operators who trained specifically for the technical aspects of firefighting. They patrolled at night, which is when fire risk was highest and when the city was most vulnerable, because the cooking fires that were banked at the end of the day were not always banked correctly, and the braziers that people lit in their rooms against the cold were not always supervised carefully, and the lamps that burned through the night in rooms full of straw and dried wood were not always positioned with adequate distance from the things they could ignite. On paper, this was a solution. In practice, as always, the solution was made of people, and people bring with them the full complexity of their situation. The Vigils were freedmen primarily. This is the first thing to understand about their social position, because in Rome's elaborately graded hierarchy of status, freedmen occupied a specific location that was legally precise and socially consequential in ways that shaped everything about how the institution functioned and how it was perceived. Freedmen were former slaves who had been manumitted, either by the formal legal process of manumission or by informal means that carried different legal consequences, and who occupied the space between their former enslaved status and the full citizenship that their freeborn neighbours possessed as a birthright. They were free. They were Roman residents. They could own property, conduct business, and participate in certain aspects of civic life. But they were not citizens, and the children of freedmen, not the freedmen themselves, were the first generation to begin with full citizenship. This distinction mattered in ways that went beyond the legal. The Vigils were not, in other words, a prestigious posting. They were not the kind of civic role that attracted men of ambition with family connections and social capital to protect. They were a useful assignment for men who needed regular employment and who could be organised into a disciplined body for a specific operational purpose. Service in the Vigils lasted approximately 6 years, and it came with a benefit that was the actual recruitment mechanism. After completing service, a freedman vigil received full Roman citizenship. The promise at the end of the service period was the reason men signed up for a job that required them to walk through the city's most dangerous neighbourhoods at night, respond to fires in buildings full of panicking people, and exercise authority in situations that were inherently chaotic and frequently violent. The work itself was what it was. The night patrol through Rome's streets, through the Subura and the Aventine and the Trastevere and the areas around the forums, through the narrow alleys and the crowded residential blocks, was not glamorous in any available sense of the word. The vigils walked their beats in the dark, watching for smoke, watching for unattended fires, watching for the early signs of the thing they were there to prevent. In summer, the work was one kind of anxiety, the dry heat making everything more combustible, the stored heat of the day making the buildings themselves feel like they were waiting for an opportunity. In winter, when people were more likely to have braziers burning indoors, and when the combination of moisture, cold, and the need for warmth drove bad decisions about open flames in enclosed spaces, the anxiety shifted register but did not diminish. When a fire was detected, the vigiles were supposed to respond in force, and there is good evidence that they frequently did. Their pumps, the siphons, were the primary firefighting technology, devices that could direct a pressurized stream of water onto a fire with some accuracy, if the fire was small enough, and if the water supply was adequate, and if the pump operators were positioned correctly, and if enough men had arrived quickly enough to make a difference. These conditions were not always met. Rome's water supply, though extraordinary by ancient standards, was not always immediately accessible at the specific location where a specific fire was burning at 2 a.m. Bucket chains were the backup, which meant enough men to pass filled buckets from the nearest water source to the fire, and the nearest water source was not always near enough for the chain to operate efficiently. Pulling down adjacent structures with hooks to create fire breaks was the third tool, one that was effective at stopping fire spread, but which required the destruction of buildings that might themselves be occupied, a calculation that does not simplify neatly into a decision even when the fire is already out of control. The vigils had legal authority in these emergency situations that went beyond the technical aspects of fire suppression. They could order the evacuation of buildings, which in a city where people had nowhere else to put their belongings and were understandably reluctant to leave them meant that evacuation was not always the simple directive it sounds like. They could commandeer water supplies and equipment from nearby establishments. They could direct the activities of people in the affected area with something approaching emergency command authority. This authority was granted because it was necessary, because a fire in a Roman insula at 2 a.m. is not a situation that benefits from procedural deliberation, and the men exercising it were operating in conditions that did not reward hesitation. What the authority looked like in practice, and who was on the receiving end of it, and what the interactions between vigils in full emergency mode and residents in the middle of a nighttime crisis actually produced, is not always well documented, because the documentation that survived is primarily the official documentation, which records the institution's mandate rather than its moment-to-moment operation. What we can say is that the vigils were men with legal authority, in a city that had a well-developed understanding of how authority worked, in situations where the people around them had very limited means of checking that authority against anything external. That is not a description of inevitably bad outcomes. It is a description of conditions in which outcomes vary considerably based on the character and training of the specific men involved. There was also the secondary function, the one that is perhaps less advertised in the official literature about the vigils. They served as a kind of night watch, a policing presence in the hours when Rome's other apparatus for managing public order, such as it was not active. The day belonged to the aediles and the urban cohorts and the Praetorian Guard in its various capacities. The night belonged to the vigils, and the night in Rome was a different country from the day. The carts and the labourers who moved through it were one part of the nighttime population. Another part was the population that preferred darkness for reasons of its own, the people whose activities were better conducted without witnesses, and the people who preyed on both groups. A man walking through the streets at night looking for fire is also a man walking through the streets at night who encounters everything else that is there. The vigils could not encounter it. And the question of what they did when they encountered it, legally, practically, informally, in the spaces between the mandate and the reality, is one that the sources gesture toward rather than fully answering. They could detain people for certain categories of offence, They had some authority to deal with disturbances. The exact contours of this authority were not, by ancient standards, very precisely defined, which is to say that the contours were partly defined by the men themselves, case by case, night by night, in the real conditions of the city's darkness. Corruption within the vigils is documented, though the documentation is of the kind that suggests a pattern without fully mapping it. Complaints, references in legal texts, accounts that appear in sources with their own agendas, but which are consistent enough across different sources to be taken seriously as evidence of something real. An establishment paying unofficial fees to the local vigils cohort was not participating in anything that required elaborate explanation. The threat of neglect, whether made explicit or merely understood in the way that certain understandings operate in certain contexts, was a form of leverage that the position provided. The vigils knew which buildings on their patrol route were the ones with problems, which ones had stored flammable materials in ways that were not quite legal, which ones had structural issues that a fire inspector would find interesting. They also knew which buildings they were supposed to patrol and how carefully. These were not unrelated pieces of knowledge. The relationship between the vigils and the city's fire inspections is another dimension of the institution that is worth considering, because the gap between what fire inspection is supposed to accomplish and what it actually accomplishes in practice is the gap between the institution and the people running it. The vigils had, in addition to their firefighting and night watch roles, some responsibility for fire prevention, which in practice meant the capacity to inspect buildings and to note conditions that created unacceptable fire hazard. Braziers too close to wooden interior walls, blocked exits, accumulated combustible material in common areas. The power to note these things and the power to decide whether and when to act on them were held by the same men, which created, in a city where most people had no practical recourse against officials who decided to find something worth noting, a situation with characteristics that should be familiar to anyone who has thought about how institutions operate when oversight is limited and the populations being regulated are vulnerable. The major fires that punctuate Rome's imperial history are worth considering briefly because they show the vigiles at the limits of their capacity, and the limits are instructive. The fire of the year 64, which burned under Nero and which destroyed enormous sections of the city including the Subura and much of the lower city, burning for 6 days before being checked and then reigniting, and burning for 3 more, gives us the most detailed single account of a catastrophic Roman urban fire. The sources disagree on its causes and on the degree of Nero's involvement in either starting or allowing it, which is normal when a disaster is both genuine and politically convenient, because a disaster that is politically convenient tends to attract a narrative regardless of the actual facts, and the actual facts in this case are not fully recoverable. What the sources agree on is that the fire was massive and that the vigils were not sufficient to contain it. This is not a simple indictment of the vigils. A fire that burns for 9 days in a city of 1 million people, in buildings constructed partly of wood and crowded together in the way that Rome's buildings were crowded together, is not a fire that any pre-modern fire suppression apparatus was going to stop with the resources available to a body of 7,000 men and the technology of the first century. It is a fire that will burn until it runs out of fuel, or until human intervention manages to create sufficient fire breaks to limit its spread. And the intervention that works in these cases, pulling down buildings ahead of the fire's advance to create gaps it cannot jump, requires decisions about which buildings to sacrifice and which to try to save. Decisions made under pressure with incomplete information, by people who are also managing their own fear of the situation they are standing in. Nero's rebuilding of Rome after the fire incorporated for the first time systematic fire safety requirements for new construction, wider streets, minimum distances between buildings, porticos that provided escape routes, height limits that were actually enforced rather than merely specified, building materials that included more brick and tile and less wood. These were genuine responses to the real conditions that had made Roman fires as destructive as they consistently were, and they show a state that had learned something from the disaster, even if the learning was necessarily incomplete, and even if the new regulations were subject to the same inconsistent enforcement as every other regulation in the city. The rebuilt Subura was different from the Subura that burned, at least initially. The question of how long the improvements lasted, how long it took for the pressures of demand and profit to begin eroding the wider streets and the safety distances and the building material requirements, is a question that Roman history provides data on, and the data is not optimistic. The training of the vigiles is another dimension worth considering, because the gap between what training is supposed to produce and what it actually produces in field conditions is one of the oldest problems in the organisation of any force whose work depends on performance under stress. The training covered the operation of the pumps, the organisation of bucket chains, the use of axes and hooks for firebreak creation, the management of a structured fire response in conditions where structure is possible. What it could not train for were the conditions under which the training would actually be applied, the specific chaos of a large fire in a dense urban environment at 2 a.m, with residents evacuating in all directions, smoke making visibility impossible at certain points, water supplies uncertain, and a crowd that is doing what crowds do under these conditions, which is frequently the opposite of what would be most helpful. The effectiveness of the vigiles in actual fire situations was therefore highly variable, dependent on the size of the fire, the speed of the response, the conditions at the site, the availability of water, the quality and alertness of the specific men on duty that night, and the 1,000 other variables that determine whether an emergency response succeeds or fails in practice. On some nights, the vigiles stopped fires that might otherwise have become catastrophic. On other nights, they arrived to find situations that were already beyond the capacity of their tools and numbers to address. The historical record gives us evidence of both outcomes. The fact that Rome continued to function as a city, continued to be rebuilt and re-inhabited after its fires, suggests that the vigiles provided some reduction in the frequency or the severity of fire damage that was meaningful even if it was not complete. At the same time, the official records show vigiles responding to fires, rescuing people from burning buildings, operating the pumps, organising the bucket chains. These things happened. The archaeology of Rome shows repeated fire damage and repeated rebuilding, which is consistent with a fire suppression apparatus that contained fires rather than one that did nothing. The question is not whether the vigiles fulfilled any part of their mandate. It is whether the gap between the mandate and the reality was managed as an institutional matter, or whether it was simply the inevitable space between what institutions say they do and what they actually do, which is a distinction with implications for how we think about the institution's failure or success. What the vigiles reveal in the end is something about the distance between the Roman state's capacity for institutional design and its capacity for institutional operation. Augustus could design a fire brigade. He could work out the mathematics of cohort distribution and assign patrol regions and equip the men with the appropriate technology. What he could not entirely control was what happened when those men, freedmen who needed the work and who were completing a 6-year bargain with the state in exchange for citizenship, walked through the city's streets at night with authority over the people they encountered and limited oversight of how they used it. The institution produced both genuine public safety and genuine opportunity for exploitation, and these two products were not separable because they came from the same men making the same patrols in the same darkness. Rome built its night watch out of freedmen and called them fire suppression and gave them the city's darkness as their domain, and what happened in that darkness was what always happens when systems meet people. Something more complicated than the charter, something less heroic than the image, and something considerably more interesting than either. They walked through the Subura at the hour when the delivery carts were loud, and the windows were dark and the city's 1 million people were doing their best impressions of sleep. They knew the streets in the way that only people who walk the same streets every night know streets, the specific geography of the city's nighttime life, its sounds and smells and silences. And whether they were, in any given hour, protectors or opportunists or some mixture of both that does not simplify into either category, they were there, night after night in the darkness, carrying their equipment, watching for smoke, watching for everything else, making the city's nights slightly less dangerous than it would have been without them. The experience of the night patrol itself, the actual sensory texture of walking through the Subura in the 3rd hour of the night with a lamp and a bucket, and the authority of the Paisa, and the knowledge accumulated from months or years of the same routes, is something we cannot reconstruct fully but can approach through inference. The streets that are loud and bright during the day are different at night. The darkness is not complete, because there are lamps in windows and lamps at certain doorways and the glow from the establishments that stay open late, but it is substantial enough to change the character of everything. Familiar streets become less familiar in the dark. Sounds carry differently. The man you walk past at night you would not necessarily recognise in the morning, and the reverse is also true. What the vigiles developed over the months of service was a specific knowledge of the city's nighttime character, which streets were busy at which hours, which establishments generated which kinds of problems at which times, which buildings had chronic fire hazards that created ongoing concern, which residents were reliable informants about conditions in their area and which were not. This knowledge was not recorded in any document that survives. It was carried in the heads of the men themselves, passed informally between cohort members, lost when a man completed his service and carried away what he knew. Every cohort rebuilt this knowledge from partial foundations, from the fragments that transferred and from the direct experience of patrol, and then built on it for the duration of their service, and then it went with them when they left. There is something melancholy about that if you stop to think about it, which the vigiles themselves probably did not, being busy and pragmatic men with more immediate concerns. All that accumulated knowledge of Rome's nighttime geography, all those years of specific attention to which corner smelled of smoke from which direction, all of it unrecorded, unpreserved, lost with the men who carried it. The institution continued. The knowledge that made the institution work at the level of specific streets and specific buildings and specific risks had to be rebuilt, continuously, by the men starting their service. Learning the streets the way you learn anything you have to learn, by walking them night after night until they become familiar enough to read. There is something that settles over you when you spend enough time with Rome's lower city, the one that lived above the fourth step, the one that ate standing at a counter, the one that slept under a roof that belonged to someone else and would belong to someone else after them. It is not quite sadness and it is not quite familiarity. It is something closer to recognition, the slow, accumulating sense that the distance between that world and this one is made of centuries rather than substance, that the things which connect us to those people are more numerous and more specific than the things that separate us, and that history, when you get close enough to it, stops being a place and starts being a feeling. Tonight we moved through 4 pieces of that world with some care. We spent a long time in the Insula, in the specific weight of a 5th floor room in the Subura, in the morning stairs and the midday heat and the evening lamp and the straw mattress that belongs to you only in the sense that you are currently sleeping on it. We felt what the city felt like from inside it, from the part of it that the senators passed through on their way somewhere else, and that the historians recorded mostly by implication in the footnotes of their accounts of more important things. What we found there was not despair exactly, though despair was available and would have been entirely reasonable. What we found was the texture of ordinary endurance, the particular human capacity for making a life in the space you have been given, for adjusting your expectations to match your circumstances, and then finding sometimes that the circumstances are not as unlivable as they appeared from the outside. The Insula was not what its residents would have chosen, but they were in it, and they made it theirs, in the ways that people make things theirs when making them theirs is the only available option. Then we sat with Juvenal, who spent his career saying, with great precision and considerable anger, exactly what was wrong with the arrangement. He was not wrong. The system that required the client to perform gratitude and the patron to perform generosity, and both of them to maintain the fiction that this constituted human dignity, was not a good system, and Juvenal knew it, and said so in hexameters of such sharpness that they survived everything Rome survived, and quite a lot that Rome did not. His legacy is the particular survival of a man who found his suffering useful, who turned the 5th floor of the Insula, and the thin wine and the cold atrium and the noise that never stopped into something that 20 centuries of readers have recognised immediately. Because the specific texture of feeling small in a large system, of performing the gestures of belonging in a place that has not decided to belong to you, is not a feeling that the centuries have made unfamiliar. It is, in fact, among the more durable features of human experience, and Juvenal documented it with a precision that serves as both archive and mirror. He would have found something wry to say about his own survival, about the fact that his name outlasted the patrons whose names he had been required to learn, and whose birthdays he had been required to attend, and whose food he had eaten in the manner of a man who is grateful for what is given, and who does not mention that what is given is not enough. That he got the last word is perhaps the most Juvenalian outcome possible, for a life that he himself would have framed as a series of indignities. He would not have been surprised. He would have had something cutting to say about how even that was not enough. We moved into the popina, which was its own world inside the world, the place where the city fed itself in the daily, practical, unheroic sense of feeding. Quickly, cheaply, standing at a counter or on a bench, without ceremony and mostly without choice. The person who worked there knew things that did not get written down, knew the neighbourhood's mood in its morning version and its midday version and its evening version, knew which customers were managing something, and which were celebrating something, and which were simply hungry and needed food. That knowledge was not considered knowledge by anyone who thought about what Rome knew and recorded and preserved. It was just the working day. But it contained, as working days usually do, more of the actual world than most official accounts have the patience to record. The popina is the place where Rome's social life happened at its most unguarded, and the person standing behind the counter was, in a very real sense, one of the city's most thorough witnesses. The counter of the popina is also the counter at which Rome's poor ate every meal they had outside their rooms, which is to say, most of their meals. The domus with its kitchen and its cook was not their world, and the popina was not a choice among other choices, but simply the arrangement the city had made for people who could not make other arrangements. And if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. And the person working behind it was, in that sense, feeding the city in the only way the city had made available to most of the people in it. And finally, we looked at the vigiles, at the gap between the man with the bucket and the civic institution that employed him, at the way that power distributed to human beings in difficult situations tends to find its own shape. Not always the shape the Charter intended, not always worse than the Charter intended either, but different and human, and navigated night by night in the real conditions of the city's darkness. Every institution you have ever encountered that depends on people doing the right thing when no one is watching has navigated some version of that gap. Rome's Night Watch navigated it through the streets of the Subura with tools and authority and the specific pressures of men who needed the work and who were completing a long bargain with a state that offered them citizenship in exchange for 6 years of walking through the dark. What all four of these things share, the Insula resident and the furious poet and the popina worker and the vigil walking his beat at midnight, is that they are all people inside systems that were not designed with their comfort as a primary consideration. Rome designed its systems for its own perpetuation, for its grain supply and its military capacity, and its administrative continuity, and the impressive monuments that were meant to communicate its permanence to itself and to everyone else. The people inside those systems were accommodated to the extent that accommodation served the system's purposes, and not much further. They knew this, most of them, in the way that people generally know the terms of their arrangement with the world they inhabit, without necessarily being able to articulate it, and without it necessarily producing a crisis. And they continued anyway, because the alternative was not really available, and because human beings are, among their other remarkable qualities, extremely good at continuing. That capacity for continuation is not the same as contentment, and it is not the same as acceptance in any resigned sense. It is something more active than that. The daily renegotiation of terms between what you have and what you need, the ongoing adjustment of the gap between what you expected and what you got, the small and large and mostly unrecorded decisions that add up, over a life to a life. The people in the Subura were making those decisions every day, in a city that was by most measures the most remarkable human construction that had yet existed, and they were doing it from the 5th floor, from behind the counter, from the atrium of a patron's house, from the street at 2 a.m. with a bucket and a lamp. Let that thought settle now, the way the city settled in its own late hours, into something quieter and slower, the lamp oil burning low, the delivery cart still loud but somehow more distant in the imagination of the person who is no longer required to lie awake listening to them. You have been in Rome tonight, in the part of it that did not leave monuments, in the part that left fingerprints on a doorframe and names scratched into a wall, and the fossil evidence of ordinary lives pressed into the stone and the plaster and the ceramic, and the charcoal-marked surfaces of a city that was, underneath everything else, made of people doing their best with what they had. That is enough. It is more than enough. Let your breathing slow with the cities. Let the weight of the day go the way the Insula resident let it go. Not with resolution, not with triumph, but with the quiet, reasonable decision that the body has done what it can, and that the night now belongs to something softer. The stairs are steep and the bread is dense, and the morning will come before you're ready for it. But that is tomorrow's problem. Tonight, just rest. You have been somewhere real. Sleep now. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.